at 00 minutes and 3 seconds. Footsteps audible on gravel. Water audible nearby. Subject A states, "It's shallow here," at 00 minutes and 27 seconds. Footsteps enter water. No splash audible. Subject A states, "That's strange." Subject B, off microphone, states, "What?" Subject A states, "It's not moving." Footsteps cease at 01 minute and 2 seconds. Subject A states, "I can't pull my foot out." Subject B states, "Stop messing around." Breathing increases. No water disturbance audible at 01 minute and 31 seconds. Subject A states, "It's holding." Silence. Subject A, quietly, states, "I'm still standing." Subject B approaches the waterline at 02 minutes and 11 seconds. Recording ends. Record type: Incident Record File. Archive Identifier: IRF-101. Designation Index: EAC_UIS. Anomaly Designation: EK-USHGE. Attributed. Engine Status: Operational. Clearance: Internal. Restricted. Originating Module. Passive Environmental Monitoring. Source Channel. Civilian Reports and Field Recovery. Review Status: Complete. Local. Review Cycles: 1. Last Attempt. Timestamp withheld. Incident Summary. The primary incident occurred at an inland freshwater reservoir under recreational conditions. The subject entered the water voluntarily. No submersion was reported. Water depth was estimated as below knee height. Upon attempted withdrawal, the subject experienced resistance inconsistent with expected fluid dynamics. The resistance was described as uniform and continuous. No discrete point of adhesion was identified. The subject remained upright throughout the interaction. No loss of balance was recorded. No involuntary movement was observed. A secondary witness present on the shoreline reported no visible disturbance of the water surface. No turbulence was observed. No displacement was recorded. No audible indicators were reported beyond subject vocalization. Disengagement occurred without external intervention. Withdrawal was described as gradual. No sudden release force was reported. The incident duration was estimated at several minutes. On-site timestamps were unavailable. Duration was reconstructed post-event. No residual markings were observed on the subject's clothing or skin. No damage to footwear was noted. No biological transfer was identified. Initial pattern note. Atlas notes that the interaction profile observed in IRF-101 is not unique. Similar reports have been recorded across multiple inland freshwater sites. Geographic separation exceeds local variance. Temporal spacing is inconsistent with a single site environmental cause. Across these reports, shared attributes recur. These include resistance encountered in shallow water, absence of surface disturbance, maintained upright posture, disengagement without external force, and delayed physiological effects. Atlas further notes that comparable interaction profiles appear in historical records predating modern environmental monitoring. These records were not originally classified under standardized anomaly frameworks. The presence of historical precedent is noted. Causation is not inferred. Case aggregation. Atlas aggregated incident data following identification of recurring interaction attributes. Initial aggregation includes 3 civilian reports logged within a 6-week window. Reports originate from separate inland freshwater sites. Geographic separation exceeds local variance. No shared access routes were identified. Temporal spacing is inconsistent with single-site environmental instability. No abnormal weather patterns were recorded across the aggregation window. No regional advisories were active at the time of the incidents. Across all reports, subjects entered shallow freshwater environments voluntarily. No subject reported full submersion. Water depth was consistently described as below knee height. In each case, resistance was encountered during attempted withdrawal. The resistance was described as uniform and continuous. No discrete point of adhesion was identified. Secondary witnesses present in 2 cases reported no visible disturbance of the water surface. No turbulence was observed. No displacement was recorded. No audible indicators were reported beyond subject vocalization. Disengagement occurred without external intervention in all cases. Withdrawal was described as gradual. No sudden release force was reported. Post-incident effects reported across the aggregation include pronounced fatigue, delayed onset thirst, and muscular exhaustion disproportionate to observed activity. No subject reported persistent injury. No medical intervention was required. No prior Atlas flag was associated with any site included in the aggregation. Atlas notes that attribute convergence across independent reports exceeds expected coincidence. A causal mechanism is not identified. System note: aggregation threshold met. Pattern classification provisional. Escalation not authorized. Attributed context. Note: following aggregation, Atlas initiated review of non-standardized historical material associated with similar interaction profiles. Prior to adoption of modern environmental monitoring frameworks, comparable incidents were recorded under locally derived attribution systems. These systems were informal, regionally inconsistent, and frequently applied in the absence of mechanistic explanation. Atlas notes that such attributions functioned as classificatory shorthand. They were not intended as assertions of physical causation. Terminology varied by source, period, and recorder. Records grouped under these historical frameworks reference interaction attributes consistent with IRF-101. Shallow freshwater environments recur. Resistance without visible displacement is noted. Witness proximity is frequently documented. Delayed physiological effects are described following disengagement. Atlas further notes that attribution frameworks were often applied retrospectively. Labels appear more frequently in post-incident summaries than in contemporaneous reporting. The presence of historical attribution is noted for context. Interpretive validity remains unverified. System note: historical attribution acknowledged. Designation retained for cross-case continuity. The designation persists despite lack of mechanistic support. Post-incident physical assessment. The subject underwent post-incident physical assessment following disengagement. No acute injury was observed. No lacerations, abrasions, or contusions were recorded. Clothing was saturated but undamaged. Footwear remained intact. No evidence of hypothermia was identified. Core temperature remained within the expected range for the reported exposure duration. Ambient conditions were assessed as moderate. Within 2 hours of disengagement, the subject reported onset of pronounced fatigue. Thirst was reported as disproportionate to exertion. The subject described muscular exhaustion inconsistent with observed activity level. No loss of consciousness was reported. No disorientation was noted. Speech and motor coordination remained intact. Dermal examination revealed no chemical irritation, no erythema, no swelling, no indication of prolonged pressure or constriction. Subsequent analysis of clothing and footwear detected no biological contaminants. No anomalous residue was identified. Water samples collected from the contact site returned baseline mineral composition. No viscosity anomaly was detected. Cardiovascular indicators remained within acceptable parameters. Respiratory function normalized shortly after disengagement. No delayed respiratory effects were reported. Symptoms resolved without medical intervention. Recovery was classified as unremarkable. System note: physiological response assessed as inconsistent with reported activity level. Observed exertion insufficient to account for dehydration severity. No explanatory mechanism identified. Comparative baseline analysis. Atlas conducted comparative analysis against known freshwater interaction baselines. Mud entrapment was assessed and ruled out. Sediment composition was insufficient to generate sustained resistance. Particle cohesion was inadequate to produce uniform force across a single limb. Observed sediment displacement was inconsistent with reported resistance magnitude. Vegetation entanglement was assessed and ruled out. No submerged plant matter capable of producing continuous resistance was identified. Absence of surface disturbance was inconsistent with entanglement scenarios. No residual plant material was recovered from the subject or site. Hydraulic pressure was assessed and ruled out. Water depth was insufficient to generate downward force. Flow was measured as negligible. No pressure gradients were identified that could resist withdrawal. Structural obstruction was assessed and ruled out. No submerged debris was detected within the contact zone. No artificial structures were present. No mechanical impediment was identified during field recovery or follow-up survey. Biomechanical misjudgment was considered. Loss of balance, suction panic, or misapplied force was not supported by witness observation. The subject remained upright throughout the interaction. No instability was recorded. Observed posture was inconsistent with panic-induced fixation. Physiological fatigue misattribution was considered. Subject exertion prior to the incident was minimal. Duration of contact was insufficient to account for reported exhaustion. Delayed onset of fatigue was inconsistent with brief exertion in shallow water. Psychological factors were assessed. Stress response may amplify perceived resistance. However, the presence of secondary witnesses and cross-case consistency reduces the likelihood of isolated perceptual error. Uniformity of resistance description across unrelated subjects was noted. A comparative review of known freshwater hazards was conducted. No baseline interaction was identified that produces resistance without displacement, turbulence, or visible engagement. No baseline accounts for delayed physiological effects, absent measurable exertion. Atlas notes that exclusion of environmental, structural, biomechanical, and psychological baselines does not yield an alternative explanatory model. In the absence of baseline resolution, Atlas extends comparison beyond contemporary classification frameworks. System note: comparative baseline analysis inconclusive. No known interaction model reproduces reported attributes. Failure of baseline resolution necessitates legacy correlation review. Designation Contextualisation. Atlas notes that the interaction profile documented in IRF-101 does not resolve within contemporary environmental or behavioral baselines. In cases where baseline comparison fails, Atlas extends correlation beyond modern classification systems. The designation index EAC_UIS corresponds to a legacy attribution framework applied to comparable interaction profiles prior to standardized anomaly modeling. Within historical records, this framework is referenced under the anomaly designation, Aggregation. Atlas emphasizes that the designation represents a historical method of grouping observed effects. It does not assert the existence of a discrete biological entity. It does not imply causation. The designation functions solely as an indexing mechanism to preserve continuity across records. Archival material associated with this designation includes parish inquest summaries, regional municipal records, and early environmental advisories originating from inland freshwater sites in Scotland. Records from the vicinity of Loch Awe, Loch Mari, Loch Lomond, and Loch Ness document drownings and disappearances occurring in shallow water under conditions inconsistent with typical environmental hazard profiles. In multiple cases, depth at the point of last contact is described as insufficient to account for loss. Immediate search efforts failed to recover remains. Attribution within these records was applied retrospectively and varies by source. No causal determination is recorded. Attribution associated with the designation predates modern instrumentation. Source material includes parish inquest summaries, regional municipal records, early environmental advisories, and non-standardized witness accounts. Terminology varies across sources. Application criteria are inconsistent. Standardization of the designation occurred retrospectively during archive consolidation. Records grouped under this designation exhibit recurring attributes consistent with IRF-101. These include resistance encountered in shallow freshwater, absence of surface disturbance, maintained upright posture, and delayed physiological effects following disengagement. Atlas notes that the designation persists, not due to explanatory success, but due to repeated attribute convergence across geographically and temporally separated cases. Removal of the designation would impair cross-case comparison. System note: designation EAC_UIS applied to anomalous interaction pattern only. The designation persists despite lack of mechanistic support. Field recovery notes. Atlas personnel conducted post-incident site assessment following civilian report intake. Assessment was initiated under standard low-impact recovery protocol. No containment measures were authorized. No escalation indicators were active at the time of entry. Initial survey focused on the reported point of contact. Shoreline integrity was verified. No soil compression was identified beyond expected footfall. No drag marks were observed. Sediment composition was consistent with baseline samples collected elsewhere along the reservoir perimeter. No displacement patterns were detected. No evidence of applied force was identified. Vegetation bordering the waterline was examined. Root systems were intact. No flattening, breakage, or compression consistent with prolonged pressure was observed. Aquatic plant matter was undisturbed within the immediate contact zone. Water clarity was assessed as within seasonal norms. Visibility reduction was attributed to suspended particulate consistent with upstream runoff. No abnormal turbidity was recorded. Personnel entered the water under controlled conditions. Entry depth matched the subject's reported depth. No resistance was encountered during ingress or withdrawal. Manual tactile assessment was conducted at the reported contact area. Standard probing tools were used. No variation in resistance was recorded. No temperature differential was detected. No pressure gradient was identified. Acoustic sampling was conducted at surface and subsurface levels. Sound propagation was consistent with freshwater control environments. No dampening or distortion was observed. No biological indicators were identified. No carcasses were present. No anomalous avian behavior was recorded. Additional field observations. Atlas conducted secondary site review 48 hours following the initial recovery assessment. Environmental conditions were comparable to the initial survey. No significant rainfall was recorded. Water level variance was negligible. Sediment at the reported contact point was re-examined. No delayed settling or collapse was observed. Compression testing yielded results consistent with baseline shoreline samples. Historical site records were reviewed for prior modification. No dredging activity was documented. No maintenance work was recorded within the preceding 12 months. Personnel conducted extended stationary immersion at the reported depth. Duration exceeded estimated civilian contact time. No resistance was encountered. No fatigue was reported. No delayed environmental response was observed following the initial incident. No changes in water behavior were recorded over the subsequent monitoring window. Atlas notes the absence of transient physical indicators despite elapsed time. System note. Follow-up assessment yielded no delayed variance. Environmental stability was maintained. Aquatic fauna were observed moving freely within proximity to the contact site. Extended presence was evaluated. Assessment duration was limited due to absence of triggering indicators. The site was cleared following completion of standard documentation. No physical evidence was recovered. System note. Field recovery did not replicate the reported interaction. Environmental conditions failed to reproduce resistance characteristics. Absence of material findings limits post-event reconstruction. Environmental consistency check. Atlas conducted environmental consistency verification following completion of field recovery. Water depth at the reported contact site measured within expected seasonal norms. Depth variation across the reservoir perimeter remained consistent with historical averages. No sudden drop-offs or gradient anomalies were identified. Sediment composition was assessed as typical of inland reservoir environments. Particle size distribution was uniform. No compaction layers were identified that could produce sustained resistance. Water flow was measured as negligible. No inflow or outflow currents were detected within the contact zone. No suction effects were identified. Surface behavior was observed as stable. No anomalous rippling, draw, or oscillation was recorded. Surface reflection was consistent with control samples taken at adjacent sites. Acoustic testing was conducted at surface and subsurface levels. Sound transmission aligned with freshwater baseline models. No evidence of sound dampening or occlusion was identified. Water temperature was measured within the expected range for the time of year. No thermal stratification anomalies were detected. Wildlife activity was observed within normal parameters. Avian presence was active. No avoidance behavior was recorded. Aquatic fauna were observed entering and exiting the contact zone without impediment. Environmental indicators were reviewed in aggregate. No deviation from baseline sufficient to account for reported resistance characteristics was identified. System note. Environmental variance classified as non-significant. No environmental mechanism identified capable of reproducing the reported interaction profile. Attributed Designation Profile, Legacy. Atlas conducted structured review of historical material associated with designation index EAC_UIS. Source records span multiple centuries and originate from geographically distinct regions. Material predates standardized environmental monitoring and formal anomaly modeling. Reporting methods vary widely in precision and intent. Atlas emphasizes that the following characteristics are attributed, not confirmed. Descriptions reflect historical attempts to rationalize recurring interaction profiles. No single source is treated as authoritative. Attributed physical characteristics. Across attributed records, the anomaly is frequently described as exerting resistance disproportionate to observable mass. Contact is most commonly reported at the lower limbs. Upper body engagement is rare. Full submersion is inconsistently described. Several accounts reference perceived density or weight beneath the water surface without corresponding displacement. Surface disturbance is frequently absent despite reported force. Descriptions of form vary significantly. Some accounts imply solidity without defined structure. Others describe indistinct mass-lacking stable boundaries. Atlas notes that physical descriptors are inconsistent and often metaphorical. No verifiable measurements are documented. No consistent morphology is identified. Attributed behavioral constraints. Attributed records describe interaction occurring primarily in shallow freshwater environments. Deep water engagement is uncommon. Flowing water is rarely implicated. Witness proximity is frequently documented. Secondary observers are often present without experiencing direct interaction. Escalation beyond initial contact is not consistently reported. No pursuit behavior is documented. No territorial expansion is observed. Disengagement from contact is described as gradual in the majority of cases. Sudden release is uncommon. Post-disengagement escalation is not reliably observed. Atlas notes that these constraints recur across geographically and temporally separated records despite variation in descriptive detail. Attributed outcome patterns. Historical outcomes associated with the designation include delayed physiological effects following disengagement. Commonly reported effects include pronounced fatigue, dehydration, disproportionate to exposure duration, and muscular exhaustion inconsistent with observed exertion. Several attributed records document collapse occurring after removal from the water. Fatal outcomes are recorded in archival material. Causation is historically attributed to the designation. Verification remains unavailable. Several historical records associated with designation EAC_UIS document subject disappearance occurring in shallow freshwater environments. In multiple cases, depth at the point of last contact was described as insufficient to account for loss. Search efforts were initiated immediately. Witness presence was documented. Recovery was not achieved. Attributed explanations frequently reference exhaustion, collapse, or inability to disengage. Descriptions vary. No consistent terminal mechanism is identified. Several archival summaries note absence of disturbance at the water surface during disappearance. No prolonged struggle is recorded. No audible distress is reported beyond initial vocalization. Atlas notes that such outcomes are disproportionately represented in attributed material relative to environmental hazard records from the same periods. Causation cannot be verified. However, outcome clustering aligns with the attributed interaction profile rather than with known drowning or entrapment patterns. System note: historical outcome severity exceeds expectations for documented environmental conditions. Verification remains unavailable. Multiple sources note absence of remains despite shallow depth and immediate search efforts. Recovery is described as inconclusive. Attributional limitations. Atlas notes that attributed characteristics derive from non-standardized sources. Descriptions frequently reflect cultural expectation, metaphor, and post-event narrative construction. Inconsistencies across records exceed acceptable variance for discrete biological classification. No physical remains are documented. No reproducible conditions are identified. Attribution persists as a historical artifact rather than an explanatory model. System note: designation EAC_UIS retained for correlation of anomalous interaction attributes. Attributed characteristics are treated as contextual data only. The designation persists despite lack of mechanistic support. Contradictory descriptive accounts. Atlas notes significant divergence in witness-described physical form across records attributed to designation EAC_UIS. Several accounts describe impressions consistent with a quadrupedal, equine-associated mass, frequently perceived as partially obscured beneath the water surface. These descriptions emphasize perceived bulk exceeding visible volume, curvature suggestive of a raised dorsal structure, and impression of limb presence without observable articulation. Other attributed records describe the anomaly as elongated or serpentine, amorphous or indistinct, or lacking any recognizable animal structure. In multiple cases, mutually exclusive descriptions originate from the same incident cluster. Discrepancies occur despite comparable environmental conditions and witness proximity. Atlas notes that equine-associated imagery appears disproportionately in regions with established folkloric attribution frameworks. Such descriptors are more frequently recorded in retrospective summaries than in immediate post-incident statements. Several witnesses revise or withdraw form-based descriptions when questioned under non-stress conditions. Others report uncertainty regarding whether a physical form was directly observed or cognitively inferred during the event. Atlas assesses that culturally available imagery may be applied to non-conforming sensory input under conditions of acute stress. Consistency of motif does not imply consistency of mechanism. No single morphological model accommodates the full range of attributed descriptions. System note. Morphological inconsistency exceeds acceptable variance for discrete biological classification. Equine-associated descriptors assessed as non-diagnostic. Descriptive accounts retained as contextual artifacts only. Persistent descriptive residue. Atlas notes persistence of form-based descriptors across multiple records despite explicit witness rejection of literal interpretation. In several accounts, witnesses deny observing a discrete animal or physical form. However, descriptive language continues to reference comparative shapes, mass, or posture. Common phrases include something shaped like, as if there were a body beneath the surface, and the impression of height or bulk. These descriptors occur in cases where witnesses later state that no animal was present. Atlas observes that such language frequently appears after the event rather than during immediate reporting. Descriptions evolve over time. Specificity often increases during retrospective narration, despite absence of new sensory input. Several witnesses explicitly express uncertainty regarding whether form-based impressions were perceived or cognitively inferred. Others report difficulty articulating the sensation without reference to familiar physical structures. Atlas assesses that persistent imagery may function as a cognitive placeholder applied when sensory input does not resolve into a stable or interpretable form. The recurrence of equine-associated and mass-based descriptors, despite conscious rejection, suggests post-event rationalization rather than direct perception. No correlation is identified between witness belief in folkloric attribution and descriptive recurrence. Imagery appears independent of conviction. System note. Form-based descriptors assessed as residual cognitive artifacts. Descriptive persistence does not imply physical continuity. Designation EAC_UIS remains non-morphological. Secondary reports, modern incidents. Atlas reviewed additional civilian reports logged following the primary incident. Secondary reports originate from separate inland freshwater sites. Geographic separation exceeds regional variance. No shared access points were identified. All secondary incidents occurred within the last 18 months. Reporting environments include recreational access areas and unmanaged rural sites. Across reports, subjects entered shallow freshwater voluntarily. No subject reported full submersion. Water depth was consistently described as below knee height. In each case, resistance was encountered during attempted withdrawal. Resistance was described as uniform and continuous. No discrete point of contact was identified. Secondary witnesses present in multiple cases reported no visible disturbance of the water surface. No turbulence was observed. no displacement was recorded. Disengagement occurred without external intervention in all cases. Withdrawal was described as gradual. No sudden release force was reported. Post-incident effects reported mirror those documented in IRF-101. Subjects reported pronounced fatigue and delayed onset thirst. Muscular exhaustion was described as disproportionate to activity. No acute injury was reported. Atlas notes reduced incidence of form-based descriptive language in modern reports. Equine-associated or animal comparative imagery was largely absent. Descriptions instead focused on sensation, resistance, and bodily effort. Atlas further notes that absence of folkloric framing does not correlate with reduced severity or altered interaction profile. System note: modern reports exhibit attribute convergence consistent with designation EAC_UIS. Reduction in descriptive imagery does not correspond to mitigation of effects. Persistence of interaction profile confirmed. Analytical Notes. Atlas notes that aggregation, environmental verification, and comparative baseline analysis do not resolve the interaction profile documented under designation EAC_UIS. Environmental causation remains plausible within abstract thresholds. However, no environmental mechanism identified to date reproduces the reported resistance characteristics without observable displacement. Physiological response patterns remain inconsistent with measured exertion. Observed fatigue and dehydration exceed expected outcomes for documented activity. No correlating metabolic or environmental stressors are identified. Psychological fixation is considered. Presence of secondary witnesses and cross-case consistency reduce likelihood of individual perceptual error. Reduction of folkloric imagery in modern reports does not correspond to reduction in reported effects. Designation EAC_UIS does not improve predictive modeling. Application of the designation does not enable identification of trigger conditions. Recurrence remains temporally and geographically irregular. Atlas further notes that descriptive instability complicates analytical modeling. Form-based descriptors cannot be reconciled into a single morphological framework. Exclusion of such descriptors does not improve outcome correlation. The designation persists despite lack of mechanistic support. Atlas assesses that continued monitoring is justified due to attribute recurrence. No actionable intervention pathway is identified. System note: analytical confidence reduced. Designation utility limited to archival correlation. Predictive value remains insufficient. Limitations. All data associated with IRF-101 are derived from post-incident reporting. No real-time instrumentation was present during any documented interaction. No contemporaneous environmental measurements were available at the point of contact. Field recovery was conducted after disengagement. Environmental conditions may not reflect conditions present during the reported interaction. Subject accounts are subject to memory reconstruction. Stress response may affect perception, recall, and descriptive framing. Retrospective narrative reliability is downgraded. Historical material associated with designation EAC_UIS lacks methodological consistency. Source documents vary in intent, precision, and evidentiary standards. Verification is unavailable. Atlas was unable to reproduce interaction conditions under controlled settings. No trigger condition has been identified. No termination condition has been identified. Absence of physical evidence limits causal inference. System note: limitations materially constrain analytical certainty. Findings reflect correlation, not explanation. Causation remains undetermined. Confidence assessment. Atlas assessed confidence levels associated with environmental and non-environmental causation hypotheses. Environmental causation remains above anomaly escalation threshold. However, confidence margin has been reduced following comparative baseline failure and cross-case aggregation. No single environmental mechanism has been identified to account for the full interaction profile. Residual uncertainty remains elevated. Likelihood of recurrence is assessed as indeterminate. Temporal spacing is irregular. Geographic distribution is non-clustered. No predictive indicators are identified. Confidence in psychological-only explanations is assessed as reduced. Cross-witness consistency and delayed physiological effects are not fully accounted for by perceptual factors alone. Confidence in designation, EAC_UIS, as an explanatory model is assessed as low. Confidence in designation utility as a correlational index is assessed as moderate. Atlas notes that confidence degradation has not reached intervention threshold. However, margin proximity warrants continued review. System note: confidence assessment revised downward. Escalation criteria not met. Uncertainty persists. System determination. Atlas conducted system-level determination following completion of confidence assessment. Incident IRF-101 is classified as anomalous interaction with insufficient mechanistic resolution. Criteria for escalation to active investigation are not met. Designation index EAC_UIS is retained. Retention is based on repeated attribute convergence across independent cases. The designation is retained for correlation and archival continuity only. No modification to public access status is recommended. No environmental advisory is issued. No interdepartmental notification is authorized. The site associated with the primary incident is added to the passive monitoring registry. Monitoring parameters remain unchanged. Atlas notes that removal of the designation would impair longitudinal analysis. Retention does not imply confirmation of causation. Retention does not imply increased risk classification. Further action remains contingent on recurrence meeting escalation thresholds. System note: system determination finalized. No intervention authorized. Monitoring continues. Archive note: IRF-101 is retained within the active archive due to unresolved inconsistency between reported interaction and observed environmental conditions. No persistence of measurable variance is identified. No escalation criteria are met. Designation index EAC_UIS is maintained for cross-reference with historical and contemporary records. Atlas notes that continued classification is based on absence of explanatory resolution rather than confirmation of anomalous causation. No further action is scheduled at this time. Monitoring remains passive. Archive pending.